everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Compassion-Driven Analysis. In this episode, I begin analyzing the complex relationship between the relief of suffering and theories of truth. As such, this episode is the beginning of a thread of episodes on this topic. All episodes in this thread about how truth theories relate to the relief of suffering will be designated with a CDA T some number in the title. This episode is CDA T01. The next one in the thread will be CDA T02, and so on. This episode is meant to introduce the issues I find most relevant to how truth theories relate to the relief of suffering. This means I will gloss over a lot of details where the devil can hide. I envision handling the details in subsequent episodes. And so, in this episode, I envision three main parts of my analysis. Part 1, a basic intuition about how knowing the truth gives us power to relieve suffering. Part 2, psychological speculation on how the degree of our suffering influences the theory of truth we promote. Part 3, my attempt to evaluate the two major contenders for the correct theory of truth. All right, part 1, a basic intuition about how knowing the truth gives us power to relieve suffering. Suffering is a problem, and I think we all have a basic intuition that knowing the truth helps us solve problems. If our car is broken, we admit that knowing the truth about what's specifically broken about it and how to fix it will greatly improve our chances of fixing the car. If we instead disregard such truth and just do random things to the car, we might fix it by accident if we had a few thousand years to try such things, but more likely we won't fix it and instead do more damage. I think the analogy applies to the problem of suffering, and I think that's why we want our plans to relieve suffering to be based in truth. That's all I currently have to say about this matter. So that's it for part 1. Part 2, psychological speculation on how the degree of our suffering influences the theory of truth we promote. Preliminary note, there are two essential competing theories of truth that I bother to address here: realism and anti-realism. Realism claims truth is a correspondence or agreement between the beliefs in our minds and the way things really are in reality, and that reality is independent of our minds. Anti-realism claims truth is nothing more than the beliefs created by our minds. If these beliefs correspond to some reality independent of our minds, they do so by accident, and we can't check whether this is the case. More strongly, a stronger version of anti-realism would simply state more strongly, there's no mind-independent reality anyway. Okay, so that's the two theories of truth I'm dealing with here. I'm going to narrow the range of issues relevant to this part 2 and focus on just one issue that pretty much makes the point I want. The issue is elitism. Yes, there are other relevant issues to how the degree of our suffering influences the theory of truth we promote, but I believe the issue of elitism will be sufficient on its own to carry this analysis forward at full force. So my psychological speculation here is this. Point 1. Elitism causes huge amounts of intense suffering. Point 2, elitism thrives under the realist theory of truth. Point 3, elitism almost vanishes under the anti-realist theory of truth. Point 4, therefore, the more we suffer from elitism, the more we will support an anti-realist theory of truth. There are some interesting exceptions, however, and I will ponder an example of one later. So let's review the points again, elaborate on the points again. Point 1, most of the suffering that we humans inflict upon one another and upon other species is done in the name of elitism, the belief that some of us are superior to the rest of us, who are inferior. I'm talking about elitisms such as racism, sexism, ableism, lookism, and so on. But not only does elitism support the suffering we inflict on one another, it also supports the suffering we simply refuse to relieve, whether or not that suffering was inflicted prior or just came from inanimate nature. Point 2, elitism thrives under a realist theory of truth. Elitism depends on a scale of value to evaluate people against. Take physical beauty as an example. When physical beauty is the scale of value, high rank on this scale of value makes you superior, while low rank makes you inferior. Realism makes these scales of value harder to challenge. Under realism, the validity of elitism's value scales must be either supported or challenged by the hard work of objectivity, reason, and evidence. Realism holds that objectivity, reason, and evidence carry or reveal truth about the real world. This means a value scale that survives a lot of these challenges in terms of objectivity, reason, and evidence is even harder to challenge. And so too is any elitism based on that value scale. We end up with a situation in which realism's objectivity, reason, and evidence supports elitism and supports the suffering elitism creates. I believe this is why we find so many elitists relying on realism to support their elitism. It makes their elitism harder to challenge. By contrast, hardly any egalitarians look to realism to support their egalitarianism. Before I hit you with point 3, I want to do an entertaining yet relevant interlude in which I show you a picture I made and sing to you. No, really, I am going to sing to you. In this picture, realism is portrayed by a character called Realist Blob, who is likely originally designed by Mad Magazine artist John Francis Putnam. My characters, Alexis and Anayanita, sing this disparaging song about him to him. You can see the picture right up here. Follow my mouse. As I click on it, there's Realist Blob. And there's Alexis with a lute. She's plucking a lute. And here's Anayanita. And she is plucking a harp, old Egyptian style harp. And so they're outdoors on the lawn here, and they're going to sing to Realist Blob, right? Or at least Alexis looks like the one who's opening her mouth. She's going to sing, and the rest of both of them will play their instruments. But anyway, the lyrics go, "Oh, Realist Blob, you're so mean, as you measure the worth of all human being by one single standard, which all can be seen, condemns so many to life's shitty latrine." I'm done showing off my average skills as a 3D model composition artist. For now. Yes, there's going to be another picture later in the same episode here. Point 3. Let's get back on track here, and I'll elaborate on point 3. Elitism almost vanishes under the anti-realist theory of truth. Under anti-realism, the validity of elitism's value scales are not supported by objectivity, reason, and evidence, because anti-realism denies that objectivity, reason, and evidence carry or reveal truth about the real world. Elitism cannot survive long under the notion that objectivity, reason, and evidence do not reveal truth. If some elitist says, "I have logically proven to you that I am superior and you are inferior," the anti-realist can reply, "But logic and proof do not carry or reveal truth about some reality independent of our minds. So your logical proof doesn't really support elitism." If the anti-realist is right, then elitism is defeated. Point 4. Let's elaborate on point 4. Therefore, the more we suffer from elitism, the more we will support an anti-realist theory of truth. If you suffer because an elitism marks you as inferior and the corresponding value scale is well defended by realism's objectivity, reason, and evidence, what do? You challenge realism at its core. You undercut objectivity, reason, and evidence. You embrace anti-realism because it does precisely this undercutting. Thus, I conclude the following psychological principle, that with most instances of great suffering comes great support for anti-realism. Again, there are interesting exceptions, and most of the time I think these exceptions represent the overwhelming minority and can be ignored in the name of brevity and carrying on towards more relevant analysis. But right now, I do want to digress a bit and talk about one of these interesting exceptions, namely myself. I offer myself as an example of one of these interesting exceptions in a few paragraphs from now, in what I have to say more generally, beginning next. Okay, at this point, I want to say something very personal and provocative. I am a realist, but I will support anti-realism for pragmatic, compassionate reasons. No, I won't actually believe anti-realism, but I will pretend to believe anti-realism if doing so helps relieve some significant suffering, up to a point. Anti-realism is the big lie that I go along with for the sake of people who just can't handle the truth. Why challenge people's neurotic delusions if that's the only thing keeping them together? No, play along, help them get through another day, unless their neurotic delusions also motivate them to significantly harm others. Then I feel torn. I don't always know how to call it. I do the best I can. It would be nice if I could console a suffering person and promote realism while doing so, but I just don't think this is possible, except in some rare cases where realism can be delicately presented as the more compassionate option. But just imagine that. Imagine someone suffers greatly because some kind of elitism has marked them as inferior in some deeply hurtful way. I come along and pragmatically say, I know you insist on anti-realism, but have you considered that realism may be the better alternative for you? The big question the suffering person might have is, okay, what's in it for me? How can realism possibly be my ally here? That's a tough question. I will try to answer it in a kind of indirect way, by offering myself as an example of how a suffering person can favor realism. It turns out that not only am I a realist, but I'm also a person marked as inferior by a kind of elitism supported by realism, as far as I can tell. And it hurts me a lot, deeply. I'd say it has just about ruined my life since childhood. As a result, I suffer chronic, debilitating sadness that cripples my productivity. I live on welfare disability funds as a result. So, how do I cope with the debilitating inferiority sadness and still be a realist? Am I a masochist? I have considered the possibility that I am a masochist. It makes some sense. I certainly can't dismiss this possibility. And maybe I frame my masochism within a narrative of noble martyrdom. I am inferior, but I will accept that and bear the suffering that entails for the sake of supporting realism, because I believe that realism empowers us to relieve much more suffering for others in the long run through the associated advances in science and technology. I forego the relief of my own suffering that would come from believing in anti-realism for the sake of relieving more suffering for future generations by believing in and supporting realism. And so here I am making a podcast episode supporting realism, even though realism hurts me deeply. I do it because I have this vision of myself as a noble martyr. It is by shifting my sense of identity to that noble martyr that I find my greater ally is realism. It hurts, but it offers me a net gain of self-love to my identity as that noble martyr. At least, that's the plausible narrative that I tell myself. I also realize that perhaps I overdo this noble martyrdom thing to the point of another kind of neurosis. Fine, but maybe it makes for some interesting podcast episodes. Witness now a neurotic noble martyr to the relief of suffering for future generations by his championing realism. But also, I recognize that I have lived a life of relative privilege, sparing me from some of the more intense suffering that might have otherwise made it impossible for me to accept realism. Hard to say. On that note, I invite you to keep watching this episode as I will now begin my analysis and final evaluation of realism versus anti-realism. That is final for this episode. Like I say, the analysis can keep going on in subsequent episodes. Anyway, so my final evaluation of this episode for realism versus anti-realism in terms of which one is really valid, and by consequence, which is ultimately more useful in the quest to relieve widespread chronic suffering for future generations or otherwise. Ooh, part 3. Which truth theory is most likely to be true? Now I will attempt to evaluate the realist and anti-realist truth theories in terms of which is more likely to be true. If you notice the circularity in what I just said, you're spot on. It is logically circular to decide which truth theory is true. This is a problem. It is, in fact, the first of 2 major problems with trying to settle on the true theory of truth. And the 2 problems will provide the structure for the rest of this episode. I will discuss the 2 problems in turn, as well as proposed solutions to the problems. So, the first problem is the circularity of trying to prove which theory of truth is true. The other problem is what I call radical epistemic skepticism. I can't really explain what this problem even is until I first have my discussion of the first problem about the circularity of proving which theory of truth is true. With that said, let's get into that first problem. So I've given the problem a name here. You can see big, bold letters, the name, the problem of universal unprovability. Well, the problem is pretty easy to spot, but I'll elaborate on it just to make sure we understand it enough. Consider, I am trying to decide which theory of truth is true. I cannot decide without already having decided. I need to commit to a theory of truth before I can declare any theory to be true, and this even applies for theories of truth. I cannot declare a theory of truth to be true without committing to a theory of truth. I must presuppose what I otherwise pretend to decide. Proving a truth theory to be true is always circularly impossible. I thus conclude the following. All truth theories are circular and thus unprovable. All of them. Now consider the consequences of this. The first consequence to consider is this. Nothing is provable. Every belief we hold true according to some theory of the proper criteria for truth. But we cannot prove that truth theory to be true, as all attempts to do so will be circular, presupposing what we meant to prove. Every belief we have suffers this problem. Every single one. Put any belief you conjecture into the brackets below. Conjecture 1, the brackets, anything you hold true. And now a second conjecture applies to conjecture 1. Conjecture 1 is anything you hold true. Here's conjecture 2 that applies to that conjecture that you hold true. Conjecture 1 is true. That's what you pretty much assume, yes. And it is true according to a theory of truth. But that theory of truth cannot be proven true without presupposing that it is true. There is no proving a truth theory to be true in a non-circular way. And if we attempt to deny this second conjecture by, say, believing there must be at least one truth theory that can be proven non-circularly, our denial will be contradicted by the fact that we end up circularly presupposing a theory of truth. So let's demonstrate this by putting the denial of conjecture 2 into the brackets that we started with. Here it is again, conjecture 1, a belief that we happen to hold true, and the belief that we hold true in this case is the denial of the second conjecture. The denial is stated as such. The true truth theory can be proven in a non-circular way. Now, that denial is conjecture 1, and now conjecture 2 applies to conjecture 1 again. Conjecture 2. Conjecture 1 is true. That's what we imply all the time anyway. And it is true according to a theory of truth, but that theory of truth cannot be proven without presupposing that it is true. There is no proving a truth theory to be true in a non-circular way. So much for denying it, but the problem even applies to our agreeing with it, like so. Conjecture 1. Now we're going to agree with conjecture 2 by placing our agreement with conjecture 2 into the brackets for conjecture 1. Conjecture 1 says all truth theories are circular and thus unprovable. And conjecture 2 applies to it again by saying conjecture 1 is true. And it is true according to a theory of truth, but that theory of truth cannot be proven without presupposing that it is true. There is no proving a truth theory to be true in a non-circular way. So even agreeing that nothing is provable won't make this fact itself provable. Okay, so I have elaborated a bit on the first major problem and included a bit of discussion on the consequences. The problem is no theory of truth can be proven true, and the consequences is that ultimately no belief of any sort can be proven true. This I will call the problem of universal unprovability. The problem of universal unprovability has a flip side to it that I also want to mention. If all truth theories are unprovable, then all truth theories have equal provability status. Any truth theory is as provable as any other. That is, not at all. This is a consequence of all truth theories being unprovable. But another consequence of all truth theories being unprovable is that any one we decide to go with must be presupposed. And the fact that all truth theories must be presupposed leads to yet another consequence of true bizarreness. Any truth theory is irrefutable, and irrefutable no matter how absurd it is. This irrefutability comes from the fact that every truth theory must be presupposed instead of proven. And once it is presupposed, it sets the terms for evaluating the truth of all competing truth theories. And this means that any truth theory is not only irrefutable, but it refutes all the rest. All competing truth theories are false because truth and falsity are decided by the truth theory that had to be presupposed in order to proceed with the evaluation of the competing truth theories. Well, it's not looking good for anyone trying to decide which truth theory is true in some unbiased way. So now I want to discuss some proposed solutions to the problem of universal unprovability. It seems to me that one approach is to allow for other kinds of validation other than just provability. This approach begins first by leveraging the intuition that validity is what we're really after here, not just provability. So it's basically the idea that something can be true even if it can't be proven true. This amounts to a kind of loosening the standards for truth, or at least loosening the standards for demonstrating truth. By itself, this loosening doesn't help much. It still allows for the flip side consequences of universal unprovability, namely that any truth theory can be the irrefutable one that refutes all its competitors. But there is something else that can help, which I will now describe. And the something else that can help is what I call the argument from incorrigibility. It has been observed, even if every truth theory is unprovable, all but one of them is self-contradictory. The one that does not contradict itself can be said to win by default. This default winner happens to be the realist theory of truth. All the anti-realist theories of truth contradict themselves. But anyway, the full idea is to allow that winning by default can be a valid way of knowing that it is the true theory of truth. We can take as true any theory of truth that does not destroy itself through self-contradiction, so long as it is in fact the single one that does not destroy itself. There's another way to describe this kind of winning by default. We can call a theory of truth that wins by default incorrigible. The connotation here is that the truth theory is like a person who can't help but behave a certain way. That behavior is incorrigible. We can't avoid it. Applied to a truth theory, we mean by this that we can't avoid it. We simply have to adopt the theory. We have to, and we do. We have no choice. Professional philosophers often use the word incorrigible to describe a theory of truth, particularly realism, just as I have described here. So here I am describing a solution to the problem of universal unprovability. Given what I've just now said about incorrigibility, I'd like to call this solution the argument from incorrigibility. The argument from incorrigibility can only work, if it does work, if all but one truth theory does indeed destroy itself with self-contradiction. But I have not argued that this is the case yet. But even if I did successfully argue for that, we could still question whether incorrigibility is a valid metric for truth. And that is what the other major problem, the problem of radical epistemic skepticism, is all about. And I'll get to that in good time. But for now, let me offer my arguments for all but one truth theory destroying themselves in self-contradiction. So, for the realist theory of truth to win by default and be incorrigible, all anti-realist theories must be self-contradictory. And this happens to be the case. Hence, we're now into a section that I call the Self-Contradiction of Anti-Realism. This is a very old story. Yes, I make two preliminary numbered notes here. Anti-realism is self-contradictory, and we've known about it since at least Plato's Theaetetus, a story in which the self-contradiction of anti-realism is first exemplified, as far as we can tell, on the historical record. But now let's get into explaining why anti-realism is self-contradictory. I think the easiest way to explain the self-contradiction of anti-realism is by way of the Omnipotence Paradox, the brain teaser that atheists throw at theists to stump them about God's omnipotence. As in, if God is omnipotent, then can God make an object that even God can't move? Anti-realist theories of truth are essentially omnipotence. All anti-realist theories of truth claim that something, such as God, society, the mind, or language, creates truth. It makes truth. And that which makes truth makes reality. It creates and controls all that exists. The maker of truth is omnipotent. As a side note, I find it interesting that progressive atheists use the omnipotence paradox to refute many conservative theists, and conservative theists point out that the cultural relativism adopted by most progressive atheists is self-contradictory when these problems are essentially the same. Culture or society is the classic progressive atheist version of God. Thus, both accuse the other of an error they both commit, making both hypocrites. Anyway, back to explaining the omnipotence paradox. An omnipotent thing can make an immovable object. An omnipotent thing can move any object. Well then, can an omnipotent thing make an object that it can't move? The omnipotence paradox pits one expression of omnipotence against another expression of that same omnipotence. Neither expression can overtake the other, nor surrender to the other. There is no resolution. Omnipotence is self-contradictory, logically impossible. An especially telling version of the omnipotence paradox is the fact that omnipotence can destroy itself. If the omnipotent thing makes truth, then the omnipotent thing can make it true that the omnipotent thing is not omnipotent. Not only can the omnipotent thing be omnipotent on Monday and decide to destroy its omnipotence on Tuesday, but it can make it true that it never had omnipotence even prior to Tuesday, thus retroactively destroying its historical omnipotence, thus undercutting its power to destroy its own omnipotence, undercutting its own power to undercut its own power, and so on. In terms of radical cultural relativism, for example, the omnipotent culture can make it true that radical cultural relativism is false, and that realism is true, and always has been true. Radical cultural relativism can retroactively destroy itself. Again, self-contradiction. Okay, So I have given an argument that anti-realism is self-contradictory. This leaves us with having to accept the realist theory of truth by necessary default. It is the only theory of truth that does not destroy itself. Realism wins by being the incorrigible, undeniable theory of truth that we must accept because any alternative to it destroys itself. Well, actually, there's another reason realism wins, a reason that is a bit difficult for me to explain at this time, so I want to save that for a subsequent episode. And of course, I know my argument so far is oversimplified, glossing over many potential objections that arise from deeper analysis. I'd like to explore the matter deeper in subsequent episodes about truth. But for now, I want to press on and discuss the other major problem in trying to decide which truth theory is true, that is, the problem of radical epistemic skepticism. And here it is, it's bold lettering, heading, waiting for us to read it. The problem of radical epistemic skepticism. Notice first that self-contradiction plays a big part in the argument from incorrigibility that lets realism win by default. The argument rests on the premise that a self-contradictory theory must be false. But we can't be sure of that. We can't be sure that a self-contradictory theory must necessarily be false. After all, self-contradiction is a principle of logic. And logic, in turn, is a pattern of thinking, a product of the way our minds work. And maybe our minds work in a flawed way. Maybe the logical workings of our minds fail to describe the way things really are, beyond our minds. Hence, maybe at least one variant of an anti-realist theory of truth could be true, even if the logic of our minds find that it is self-contradictory. Self-contradiction doesn't prove anything about the real truth or falsity of a theory. All self-contradiction shows is that our minds function in a way that makes a theory merely appear false. So even if an anti-realist theory of truth is self-contradictory, it could still be true. So you see, the idea here is to drive a wedge between how our minds work and how things really are, to disconnect logic from reality. This amounts to a kind of skepticism where we must doubt that our minds have any grasp of how things really are. This radical epistemic skepticism is also an ingenious way to try rescuing anti-realist truth theories from the self-destruction of logical contradiction. Suppose, for example, I offer some logically sound refutation of radical epistemic skepticism. The radical skeptic can merely reply that the refuting logic of my argument is just a product of how our minds work, and thus proves nothing about whether or not radical epistemic skepticism is actually false. As such, radical epistemic skepticism is a self-sealing premise that can nullify any argument against it by merely applying radical epistemic skepticism to all such arguments against it. At this point, all epistemic hell breaks loose. Radical epistemic skepticism can't be refuted, and so proceeds to revive all the anti-realist truth theories that had been sent to their graves by logical self-contradiction. And all these anti-realist candidates for the true theory of truth come out of their coffins proclaiming themselves the only irrefutable true truth theory that refutes all the others. And by the flawed limits of our logic-bound minds, all these truth theories are both correct to claim that they are irrefutable and correct to claim that they refute all others. All this is a mess of self-contradiction that we can't make any sense of, but that's just because of the limited way our minds work. Oh well. Thanks a lot, radical epistemic skepticism. And now I want to consider how to deal with radical epistemic skepticism. Of course, I'd like to refute it, but it's a self-sealing premise that's immune from refutation. I can indeed show that radical epistemic skepticism is logically impossible. It can only oscillate between being self-contradictory and being infinitely regressive. But that's just logic, and the truth-bearing validity of logic is precisely what's being challenged here. My only weapon is logic, but radical epistemic skepticism has disqualified logic. I'm trapped trying to refute an irrefutable foe. I can't get out of this trap. There is nothing I can do. Here's another way to follow what's going on here, where you can see, I will also go into the logical problem, at least one manifestation of the logical problem with radical epistemic skepticism. I will demonstrate it in this. So radical epistemic skepticism invites me to refute it by presenting me with the following lure. Insert logical refutation of radical epistemic skepticism here. And there's the brackets. You can see you could put any logical argument that refutes radical epistemic skepticism in those brackets. There you go. That's my variable written out here, big bold letters. Any logical refutation of radical skepticism. You can put it in there, man. Okay. Radical epistemic skepticism then springs the trap by replying, that refutation is the product of our logical minds. We cannot prove logic reveals truth, and therefore cannot trust that refutation. Brrr. I could in turn counter-reply, but what you just said is also just more logic. You therefore rely on the validity of logic to refute the validity of logic. You therefore contradict yourself. But then my counter-reply ends up in the original lure again. The lure that says, insert logical refutation of radical epistemic skepticism here. But instead of, any old thing, what I just said gets plugged in there. What I just said was, but what you just said is also just more logic. And therefore, you rely on the validity of logic to refute the validity of logic. You therefore contradict yourself. And radical epistemic skepticism springs the trap again. That refutation is the product of our logical minds. We cannot prove logic reveals truth, and therefore cannot trust that refutation. We can see this could go on infinitely. Time for me to show another picture I made that depicts this infinite regress. Okay, back to this picture viewer here. Here we have the picture where we have, my character Linda over here and my character Zach over here. Linda is taking the side of radical epistemic skepticism, and saying logic is a mental construct divorced from reality, and Zach is replying, what you just said logically refutes itself. And these two things mutually undercut each other infinitely, just in infinite cycle, and that's why I kind of like to portray this as two speech bubbles interlocking in a manner that looks like the yin-yang circle. All right, so that was a little interlude of visual art entertainment there. Okay, so if there is nothing I or anybody can say to defeat radical epistemic skepticism, what can be done? What I propose to be done about it is some variation of the aesthetic argument against radical epistemic skepticism. Well, first let's take note that radical epistemic skepticism not only refutes any argument against it, but it of course also refutes itself. In fact, it refutes any theory about anything. By refuting the validity of our minds, it refutes any idea our minds can possibly have. We cannot have ideas. It shuts down our minds. We cannot think, cannot speak. Well, of course we can. It's just that whatever ideas we have, whatever we think and whatever we speak can't be demonstrated to correspond to anything beyond our minds. Okay. I had the idea that I would demonstrate this consequence of radical epistemic skepticism by sitting in silence while a cacophony montage of human cruelty and suffering plays behind me for an extended period of time, like for the entire rest of this episode. So let's just imagine that I did that. Imagine you've just seen me sit in silence while suffering grinds away for, well, days and days. That would convert my podcast into a kind of Andy Warholish, Samuel Beckettish art performance. And maybe that's what life becomes under radical epistemic skepticism. One big Warhol Beckett. But I would not be able to assert as such. Just got to keep sitting in silence. Just got to keep sitting in silence. But I can't assert that this is so. Just got to keep sitting in silence. But cannot assert that this is so. Just got to keep sitting in silence. But cannot assert that this is so. Just got to keep sitting in silence. But cannot assert this is so. Just got to keep sitting in silence. But I cannot assert this. You get the idea? No. People are suffering, and I want to use my mind to figure out how to relieve that suffering. And the moment I commit to using my mind, whether it is to relieve suffering or not, is the moment I reject radical epistemic skepticism and presuppose realism. So my ultimate reply to the radical epistemic skeptic is not one of logic. It is one of compassion. My ultimate reply is not a reason-based argument, but an aesthetic argument. My compassionate intention to relieve suffering is my refutation of radical epistemic skepticism. And my refutation propagates back through radical epistemic skepticism to revive the argument from incorrigibility that validates realism. I am a realist because I want to relieve suffering. But that's just me and the aesthetic argument that works for me. Another person could have a contrary aesthetic argument that would work just as well for refuting radical epistemic skepticism. Some asshole could say, for example, I love being cruel and causing extreme suffering. I want to use my mind to figure out how to maximize the suffering I cause. So I reject radical epistemic skepticism and accept realism. There are many aesthetic reasons for using our minds. Any of these aesthetic reasons will be a reason to reject radical epistemic skepticism and accept realism. But what's relevant here, for those of us who do want to relieve suffering, is that insofar as we, too, want to use our minds to solve the problem of suffering, we, too, will reject radical epistemic skepticism and accept realism. If realism wins, does elitism win? This is a hearkening back to my discussion about how elitism is often supported by realism. So if realism wins, it becomes a relevant question here. Does elitism win? But, oh shit, I have just produced an argument in favor of the realist truth theory, from which elitist fascists find much support. I am enabling malevolent elitism. I have a gut suspicion that elitists, such as white supremacists, have made recent political gains because political moderates have turned against progressives, in large part because these moderates have seen the postmodern lunacy of radical progressives shunning reason itself in the name of some self-contradictory cultural relativistic theory of truth. The Brett Weinstein fiasco at the Evergreen State College may be a study case for this phenomenon. In some sense, we are stuck between postmodern lunacy and malevolent elitism. A vote against one is a vote for the other. And this is tragic. What I see here is that to save us from malevolent elitists, Progressives need to win the hearts of moderates, but moderates are terrified of the postmodern lunacy of cultural relativist truth theories, so terrified that they'll vote for someone like Trump. This is an idea that has been suggested by Sam Harris. What I propose is that progressives abandon cultural relativism, that is, abandon all anti-realist truth theories, and adopt realism. Consequently, part of my agenda here is to sell realism to progressives. To do that, I need to clear up a lot of misunderstandings about realism. Despite the history of elitists having weaponized realism against egalitarian kindness, realism is not the solid ally of elitism that most progressives think it is. There's plenty of room within realism for lots of egalitarian relativism, cultural or otherwise. Realism can be the ally of much egalitarian kindness. You just got to know how to work it. Anyway, I hope to elaborate on this point and many others in subsequent Truth Thread episodes of this podcast. Thanks for consuming my media. Come back again sometime. Yeah, y'all come back for more. Bye.